A sociopath may pick up on somebody's feelings, but it isn't true empathy. It's what they call dark empathy. They pick it up, but they utilize it for their own gain. Remember, what is the goal for them? Conquest. They want to conquer. So, this week's episode is going to be a much deeper dive on a topic that I talked about last week, which was wolves in sheep's clothing. The Bible talks about how you will know them by their fruit, and that we need to be aware of false prophets or of people that come into our lives who are assigned to us by the enemy. And so this week, I'm going to dive deeper into some of the dynamics behind wolves in sheep's clothing. Primarily, I'm talking about sociopaths and narcissists. I've done some content on narcissism, but this week, I'm going to primarily focus on sociopaths. Now, I just want to say a couple of things. Number one, just because somebody has a bad time or gets frustrated does not mean they're a narcissist. Just because someone can display a bit of selfish behavior does not mean they're a narcissist either. And just because somebody might go through an experience and maybe lack some empathy does not mean they're a sociopath. But there are some very distinct qualities of sociopaths and narcissists that we want to be aware of. Now, as I've mentioned before, with narcissism, there's different levels of narcissism. They say that we all have a little bit of narcissism in us, meaning that we all have a bit of selfishness in us. But narcissism and truly NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, goes beyond the bit of selfishness. There's a whole inner dynamic that plays out in narcissism. And the same is true for a sociopath. So we definitely have dealt with them at one time or another. And that can sound a little daunting or a little scary. And I agree with you. But I do believe that because we're believers and the way that God works, it's not the end of the line for people that could even be diagnosed with these things. So let's break down who they are and what the differences are, because I think it's important to understand some of the psychological dynamics, but it's really important to understand the spiritual dynamics. And that's what I wanted to get into today, so that if you come across somebody like this, you can be praying, right? We want to intercede for people that are stuck in this pathology, but we also want to be aware of them and we want to get out of their way. Now, this topic is a fascinating one for me, partly because I'm a why person. If you haven't figured that out, I am somebody that wants to understand the why behind the behavior. And I feel like in the past, I did that as a way to try to mitigate my pain. In other words, if I can understand all of the reasons and the psychological dynamics behind why somebody did something, maybe I just don't have to feel so bad about what they did. I quickly realized that that isn't the answer. In other words, even if I understand the why behind somebody's behavior, it still hurts. However, I do believe that through revelation and through revelatory experience, God can show us things that can help us to navigate our lives better, to navigate difficult people better, and to steer clear of people who may be assigned to simply just trip us up. And so I do believe there's power in this podcast. I am certain that you have encountered this personality type, whether in your personal life or your work life or your ministry life at one point or another. But I do believe if we understand some of the dynamics behind it, then we can really understand how to navigate this. This podcast is called Reflections of the Father's Heart. Well, part of the Father's heart is that we would learn the enemy's schemes and we would learn how to navigate those better, that we would grab the spiritual weapons that we have so that we're not always in a place of being harmed by people who have wicked agendas. That is a part of the Father's heart. Another part of the Father's heart is that we would know how to heal when either we've been raised by people like this or we've been in a relationship or a friendship with somebody like this. Like I was mentioning, this is a deep topic for me, a fascinating topic, a why topic, because I was raised by people that were narcissistic and sociopathic. I had a lot of that around me. And so understanding it and then even understanding it spiritually has been really helpful for me. And because I was raised in it, there were times when I tended to attract people who were either narcissistic or sociopathic, or I tended to miss the flags because I was raised with people that I was trying to love and trying to depend on who didn't operate the way that a lot of people do. And so understanding this topic has been very, very helpful to me. And I believe it will be to you as well. So let's just start. I'm going to break down just some differences between narcissism and sociopathy. So basically, narcissistic personality disorder is marked by these inner dynamics. A narcissist typically, and so when I say narcissist, I do mean somebody who has the full-blown disorder. Narcissists, believe it or not, are marked by a tremendous amount of shame. I do want to say, though, that there's a saying out there that says, hurt people hurt people. And when you hear this explanation, then it's easy to grab that and go, I knew it. They're just hurt people out there hurting people. Well, I don't really like that saying because of the way that it's used. It's true that there are hurt people that end up hurting other people. I also know a lot of people who are hurt who go out and help a lot of people. But I believe that saying hurt people is often used so that people have an excuse for either exhibiting really poor behavior or an excuse for somebody who's greatly harmed them. So I don't want you to take this explanation and understanding as a way to minimize the impact of this person. I'm just going to give you some of those inner dynamics so that you can have some differentiators. So basically, narcissistic personality disorder is marked by an inner dynamic of extreme shame. They are typically someone who has gone through trauma. It's not uncommon for people with NPD to have had very traumatic or very neglectful experiences. So either they've had great harm done to them or they were highly neglected, even emotionally neglected as a young child or even as a baby. Now, I know that sometimes we want to think of it as the child that was overindulged, but in my experience, I have found that yes, perhaps the child was overindulged, but it typically was coupled with trauma and overindulgence. So it usually isn't just the overindulging in and of itself. What happens in the inner world is that the core of the narcissist, which would be maybe the little child that was greatly harmed, is carrying a tremendous amount of shame, is very almost weak in spirit. And what happens is that in order to survive those blows and that harm and that trauma, what they do is they live in a very disassociated state. And so in order to live disassociated, meaning I'm not really in my skin, I'm not really in my body, they create what is called a false self. They create a mask or an image that they project to the world. Now, the other dynamic of a narcissist, and this is really key, is, and this is where the spiritual dynamics come in. I want you to understand that anytime there's a personality gap, and what I mean by that is we're disconnected and disassociated from ourselves at every level and we're in coping, it creates these gaps inside of us. You know, we live in a society where a lot of us are very black and white thinkers, but we're really made of very different components. And God made it so that all of our components would just work together so beautifully. But what happens for a narcissist is they're very disjointed. They're not connected to themselves at all. And filling in the gap is typically what's called a protector spirit. Protector spirits are very high up on the chain. They can work in tandem with Jezebel or Leviathan or even an Ahab spirit. But a protector spirit comes in to protect the very shame-based core self of the narcissist. That is the enemy or the evil spirit's role or goal. And so what you find in narcissists is you may not see the shame inside. A lot of us who are empathic, though, have a tendency to pick up on this poor, victimized, shame-filled inner child, and we get really drawn into them. But the problem is that we are then part of their cycle. It's a dangerous place for somebody to sit because narcissists are marked by projection. They're very, very difficult to work with. So if you're somebody listening to this going, oh my gosh, Sandi, but I am very fractured and I am very shame-filled and I did create like this false sense of self. But the difference is that you're probably an internalizer. You probably internalize things that are done to you or the way people treat you as being there's something wrong with you, and you probably do a lot of self-reflecting, that is a different inner world than the narcissist. This is where it gets different. Narcissists operate in what's called projection. The way that they protect themselves is by projecting the pieces of their character and their personhood that they don't like or have disdain for, and they project it onto other people. And then here's the spiritual part. And then the protector demon punishes the other person or people for the very thing the narcissist hates about themselves. That's what makes them so dangerous. Because for a narcissist, you have to understand they believe the projection to be true. That's why they're such gaslighters. That's why they're so good at gaslighting. I'm not saying they're totally unaware of the gaslighting, but a lot of it is driven by this belief inside that they're literally seeing something in the other person that they actually hate about themselves. So, for example, that is why if a narcissist is cheating on their spouse or significant other, or they're cheating financially on their business partner, they become very accusatory. They will accuse the business partner of financially cheating on them, or they will accuse their spouse or significant other of cheating on them, of doing things that are distrustful, because that's what they're doing. And they believe the projection. They believe it to be true. And then not only do they become accusational, they become very punishing. They start to punish the person. You see, for a narcissist, because of the gap, because they're not connected to their core self, they require constant outside validation. They look for what's called narcissistic supply. They look for people to feed that false self, to feed that ego, because they are constantly in need of, you could call it new juice. They're constantly in need of validation, empathy, emotional feedback. They're in constant need of it because they are not connected to their core self. And that's why they also don't exhibit empathy. So a narcissist is looking and is out to control people. So you have overt narcissists, which are the ones that you're around them, and after you're around them for a while, at first you might find them really charming and they seem to mirror you and mirror your emotions. And then after you get to know them, you're like, oh my goodness, this person behind the scenes is a nightmare. And that's the reality of a lot of a lot of the overt narcissists. Your covert narcissists are also looking to control, but they do it bottom up. They have the same inner dynamics, but instead of overtly controlling, they do it through manipulation, through overly pleasing, but they're really just doing it so that they can continue to get fed, because they continually need to be fed. And what happens in that inner dynamic where you have the spirits that are operating at a very high level because they're not connected to their core self, then what happens is that it's almost like they want to feed on you so that, again, they can constantly get that battery filled up. Now, sociopaths are a little bit different. Sociopaths often do have traumatic experiences. Sociopaths can exhibit some of the same types of behaviors as narcissists, but sociopaths are not shame-based. Sociopaths are completely disconnected from conscience. Now, you may have experienced a narcissist and feel like the narcissist has no conscience whatsoever, but the reality is narcissists are still connected to conscience. It's just they have a lot of hoops that they jump through from a coping perspective to where they don't violate their conscience because they project what would normally affect their conscience onto another person. That's why narcissists are so hard to treat, because they never think there's anything wrong with them. They always think it's the other person because they're projecting that shame. They're projecting the things that would cause them shame onto someone else. Sociopaths disconnect fully from conscience. So that's the marking difference. And a sociopath, though the inner dynamics may be somewhat similar, they're not jumping through as many hoops in terms of a coping perspective as a narcissist does. Sociopaths are void. They're vacant. they don't connect to conscience, which is what makes them extremely dangerous. Now, I think a lot of times when we think of a sociopath, I know when I think of a sociopath, I think of Hitler, I think of Ted Bundy, I think of notorious serial killers who were able to just kill and act like nothing was wrong, and the way they could lure their victims in, like, that's a sociopath. And that's true, those are sociopaths. But oftentimes, sociopaths are not necessarily violent, they're just vacant. And that does make them dangerous, but it makes them dangerous in different ways. Sociopaths, because they have disconnected entirely from conscience, are also demonically driven. If I'm disconnected from my conscience, then I have disconnected from the very God-given modality that has been put in me, right? The scriptures say God put eternity in their hearts. There is something morally and compass driven that the Lord has put inside of each and every one of us. But sociopaths, there's psychological information where they believe that sociopaths simply don't have a conscience. I don't believe that to be true. I believe the conscience is there, but whether it's through trauma, whether it's through generational line, whether it's through being raised in Satanism or mind control experiments. I mean, mind control experiments create sociopaths because mind control experiments are looking to violate a person's free will. That's what they're trying to do, is take over their mind, fracture them to a degree that they can be controlled and accessed and have their memories wiped out. Well, the only way that you're going to truly be able to control someone is if through enough experimentation, especially if you do it on babies and children. And yes, that has happened a lot. Well, if you do that to a degree, then you will have somebody that is completely disconnected from their conscience. And again, it could be through trauma. It could be through mind control. It could be through stuff coming through the generational line. It could be things that happen even as a person gets older. I look at, like, there's one of my parents that at this point is definitely a sociopath. However, I don't think this parent was always that way. I just think the more and more and more this one particular parent continued to look the other way, live in denial, agree with the sadistic narcissist in the home, the further and further away this parent became from conscience, to the point where it's completely seared. The Bible talks about the hearts being darkened and the searing that happens. Well, a seared conscience, meaning that it's so hardened, there's no connection anymore. Now you've got a sociopath. But a sociopath doesn't go after control in the way that a narcissist does, because a narcissist is looking for the supply. Now, a sociopath is, however, a sociopath looks for conquest. So a narcissist, it's control. A sociopath, it's conquest. What they share in common is that they both exhibit a lack of empathy. What you will notice in sociopaths, though, is where narcissists tend to cycle between what would almost seem like softness and rage, unless they're covert. And then you're going to find it a lot more subtly, but the cycles will happen. What you'll see in sociopaths is utter vacancy. It's almost like they look through you. There's a vacancy in their eyes. And sometimes they can hide it better than others, but sociopaths deal with vacancy, because what our conscience does is it connects us to humanity. It connects us to love. It connects us to seeing that there is something bigger than ourselves. And that being able to see something bigger than ourselves. Yes, God is bigger than us, but there's also this connection that we have where we understand that humanity is also important. We, in our consciousness, connect to our fellow humans, and we want the best for our fellow humans as well. Sociopaths are void of this. So a sociopath is dangerous for a different reason. They're dangerous because in their vacancy, instead of needing the validation and, needing to be propped up, they are just looking to drain you. It's like they need to be replenished in a different way, because it's not that it's necessarily filling them up. It's just that they fill the void in conquest. Now, that conquest could be you might have, let's say, a predator who is going around, and let's just say it's a man who's a womanizer, and his conquest is how many women can I be with? That can be a form of sociopathy. Now, another form of conquest could be you could have somebody who, let's say, is a doctor and is really accomplished. There's a book called The Sociopath Next Door that gets into a lot of the psychological dynamics of a sociopath. And one of the examples that they give is this doctor that was really accomplished, and everybody thought this doctor, I believe it was like a psychiatrist or psychologist, was amazing. But the truth is, they had lied about their credentials. And what they would do is when, let's say, colleagues started to do well at the workplace, they would find ways to take them out. It's conquest. That's why a lot of times when you see people that were, faking to be a doctor, and they do these horrible things, they're sociopaths. It's conquest for them. So, for example, there was a documentary about a doctor who had said that he was performing these operations that would replace people's windpipes, and that he had created this prosthetic windpipe, and that he'd done all this research, and he was flown into the top hospital in Sweden in the country to perform a surgery there. And the news would, come and do reports on him. And he would claim that after, a month, it had been successful. But the truth is, it was a hoax, basically. The windpipes were faulty. They had never really been peer reviewed. They hadn't been tested. And the people that got the surgeries ended up dying really horrible deaths. I know this is deep waters, but I share this with you because, I look at that and go, what in the world? What is the point to all that? What do you get out of that? Why would you do that? That's a sociopath. That's what a sociopath is capable of. But we can encounter a sociopath who may not exhibit any of those signs, except that when you're in their presence, there's like I said, a vacancy. And because they are vacant, they want to drain you. It's not like the narcissist where it's like, validate me, validate me, validate me. A narcissist will systematically look to drain you of your time, your resources, your emotions, and your anointing, because of the vacancy inside. And because there's so much vacancy and this disconnection from consciousness or conscience, because of that, they are often in and of themselves very bored. And interestingly enough, they're very hyper fixated. One of the things that I learned is that for a sociopath, because of the vacancy, because of the disconnect, they are hyper aware of every little thing that happens in their bodies. A paper cut for them is a catastrophic event. They're constantly in fear of something being wrong with them to an extreme extent. They're always feeling something wrong in their bodies. What I didn't know is that Hitler was so paranoid that he had cancer that he kept paying this doctor for all of these extreme remedies. And some of them were hallucinogenic, toxic drugs that Hitler would take that ultimately made him extremely sick. But he was hyper fixated that there was something wrong with his body. This is something that happens for sociopaths. The other thing to remember about sociopaths is that, again, because of the vacancy, because of the lack of love, the lack of connection to another person in that way, it doesn't mean that they can't feel another person's emotions. It just means they don't really feel their own. They have to intellectualize emotional experiences. And this is where I just have to give a shout out for grieving and grief recovery. I know y'all hear it a lot, but I'm just going to say it again. This assault on emotions and our feelings, and don't feel them, and they're bad and they're wrong, it's killing us. Because if you sear your heart long enough, you start to sear your conscience. Do you know that your emotions are a way that you tap into your experience of conscience? It's like shame is a feeling. Now, shame is often utilized by the enemy to bring us into condemnation, but where it should in a healthy way lead us is conviction. Where the narcissist deals with their shame by projecting it onto others, the sociopath simply doesn't feel it at all. They don't feel shame. However, they can. I'm not saying all of them can exhibit signs of empathy, because I did say earlier, like, oh, they lack empathy. They do, but the only kind of true empathy that they have is what's called dark empathy. So if they do pick up on your feelings, some of them can, but because they don't feel their own feelings, it's not like it brings them to this place of, I'm empathizing with you. So let me break that down and explain what that means. If I sit with somebody and they're in a place of heartbreak, even if they don't tell me that, I can pick it up because I'm very empathic. But when I pick up the sadness, because I connect to my own sadness, I am then in a state of great compassion because I know what sadness feels like. So when I sense or pick up their sadness, because I have an experience of my own sadness, I am moved to compassion, and I am then moved to want to be with that person because I want their heart to feel better. Now, us people that are empathic have to learn how to not take on the sadness, but we're very skilled at being able to be with it. And in the being with, we're really good at drawing people out for the purpose of helping them to feel better. A sociopath may pick up on somebody's feelings, but it isn't true empathy. It's what they call dark empathy. They pick it up, but they utilize it for their own gain. Remember, what is the goal for them? Conquest. They want to conquer. Well, how do you conquer another person? One of the ways that you can conquer another person is you can conquer them by picking up on their feelings and then using that to further your own agenda. I dated a person one time, and I remember we were away somewhere. We were at a beach or a gathering of people, and I started, I started to feel insecure, and I started to have these thoughts, which is interesting because I don't even get them anymore. But at the time, in the moment, it's just this wave of insecurity hit me, and there was a group of us together, and I said, you know what, I'm going to go take a walk. And the person who was dating me went and walked with me, and he was like, what's going on? What's wrong? And I said, I'm just having these overwhelming feelings of that I'm ugly, that I'm not pretty, that I'm not beautiful, and it's hitting me really hard. It almost feels like an attack, but the feelings are really intense. And so he went into this reassurance of, oh, that's so crazy because you're so beautiful. And in the moment, I felt better. But then later, I was with him and we were with another friend, and he pulled out that information as a way to take power over me. He said to this other woman, this other friend, yeah, can you believe it? Like, she doesn't think she's beautiful. But he said it in a way to like it undermined me. It demeaned me in the moment. And it took this very vulnerable piece of information and weaponized it to make me feel less than. And he did that often, except I didn't always pick up on it, because I mistakenly thought, well, if he picks up on my feelings, then he must be a very empathic person. He was not. He wasn't empathic. He exhibited what's called dark empathy, where he would utilize information for his own gain because conquest was the only thing that he had left. It's a very sad state to be void of consciousness, or void of conscience. Consciousness is a different thing, but it's a very sad state to be void of conscience. Now, I want to read you a couple of things that I think are really important. When a person does not have a sense of responsibility based on emotional attachment to a person, they are most often fixated with domination. Sometimes that domination is top down, and other times that domination is bottom up. However, it is always a one-sided endeavor. The results are substantial life disruption and ultimate deterioration. This is directly opposed to love your neighbor as yourself. So exceptional conscience, right, is about being connected to something bigger than ourselves. It's a moral sense based on emotional connectedness. Evil is a hollowness where something should have been. It is an absence. And so sociopathy chooses conquest over connection. Look at the story of Cain and Abel. It's a very prolific story, where the Lord says, sin is crouching at your door. Like, you have an opportunity here. You can either go with your murderous thoughts, or you can do the right thing. And what did he choose? He chose murder. And when he chose murder, what was he doing? He was disconnecting from conscience. He was disconnecting from the internal voice that said, do the right thing. And he chose to disconnect from that and then murdered. And so a lot of times when people continually choose to disconnect from the voice, they get to a state where they are so disconnected from it, they can no longer feel it, and they operate in a state of being very hollow. Now, sometimes a sociopath can be somebody, because they don't connect to conscience, they can be very successful because they can easily step on people. Other times, they may just be somebody who could be really good at manipulation. It's interesting because a lot of times when professionals interview people that they've discovered are sociopaths or even diagnosed as a sociopath, what they do is that when they do that, they find that a lot of them have learned that one of their best weapons to conquer someone is they've learned how to elicit sympathy. That's your bottom-up sociopath. They know how to elicit sympathy. They've learned they can weaponize it, that people will feel sorry for them. And as a result, they get stuff. And so they can conquer in this way. Conquering is always about using people. If they harm someone, they don't care, right? That could be the person that has been living with their significant other and living off that person for years and years and years, and always finds a way to be the victim and always finds a way to not get a job. At the same time, the sociopath could also be a top-level CEO who is so cutthroat in his business decisions that he makes the company a lot of money because he doesn't care about the well-being of his fellow person. He's totally good with making cuts. Hard conversations are not hard for him or her, because sociopaths can be female as well. So with a sociopath, again, you've usually got those, I call them higher hitter demons at work: Jezebel, Leviathan. Usually the protector spirit you're going to find with the narcissist, but typically with your sociopaths, you're going to have that. It's that Jezebel spirit, that Leviathan spirit at work. Now, it's typically not one. Usually when somebody has a lot of demonic oppression, and again, I'm saying oppression, this doesn't necessarily mean the person is possessed, then those are the demons that are the dominant demons at work. When somebody has these spiritual dynamics of sociopathy, what happens is that the spiritual dynamics are, you've got these heavy hitting demons in the front, and then you've got these lower level demons there. And so the reason that you see the vacancy is because they're disconnected from conscience. And then the reason that they're sucking the life out of people is because demons are like batteries. They need to grab onto life force in order to continue to have power. And so that's what they're doing. And because the demon is at the helm, the more that they conquer, the more they want to conquer. And that then goes to, I think, the burning question that a lot of people have, myself included. And that is, could somebody with the pathology of a narcissist or a sociopath be a Christian? And the answer is yes. I'm not saying that, somebody who's out there, doing crazy things could necessarily be a Christian. But on the other hand, I think it's possible. And here's why. I think too many times as believers, we're so black and white in our understanding of salvation. And yes, the Bible makes it clear and simple. But again, the Bible teaches we have a lot of components to our being. And if somebody is really fractured and their core self accepts Jesus, then they might have fractured parts that operate as a sociopath or a narcissist while they're being sanctified. Now, do I believe that a narcissist or sociopath would then stay that way if they were a Christian? No. I don't believe they would stay that way, but I don't believe that they would instantaneously be healed of that. it would take time and sanctification for that to happen, because those other parts have to be brought in to the Holy Spirit and brought in under the unction of the Holy Spirit. They would need healing and deliverance to get there. So deliverance is a really significant part of healing narcissism, of healing a sociopath. Because again, sociopaths are not just wandering around looking to kill people. They're not always that way. And as I've said before, because they operate from conquest, they might be conquering in smaller ways. One of the things that a sociopath will do is they will mimic behaviors in order to earn trust. And they do that consciously. And, naturally this is what's so interesting too, is because naturally in our close relationships, we do that anyway. We do when we get really close to people and we love them. Haven't you ever been around a married couple, like they've been married a really long time and they finish each other's sentences and there's just behaviors that they mimic in each other that has just happened as a result of their love relationship? A sociopath will do that as well. But the difference is that the sociopath does it because they're wanting to earn trust so that they can conquer. We do it because it's part of trust building and it's part of building love. But ultimately, if you're in a relationship with a sociopath, ultimately it will start to feel one-sided and hollow because they can't keep that up forever. And the more that it feels hollow, if you're a person of empathy, the more you're going to try to fill in the gap. You're going to try to fill in the hollowness with your emotions, with your connection. And it's almost like a black hole. See, with a narcissist, what happens is that when you meet a narcissist and they're really charismatic and they're displaying those behaviors that are also building trust, and you almost can even connect that there's this withered person inside that you also want to help, and they've got all these wonderful grandiose behaviors. Maybe they're very charismatic, maybe they're very outgoing, and what happens is that you fall in love with them or you become good friends with them because you just think they're amazing to be around. And then things start to shift and change, and then they start to put you down or they start to undermine you. And what happens is that you get stuck in this trap of you're constantly trying to get back to that original connection, to that person that you fell in love with, to that friend that you knew you had connected with, to that business partner that was just amazing. You are always trying to get back to that place. And you get hints of it in the narcissistic cycle, but it never quite gets there because that's never who they were to begin with. With a sociopath, it's different. It's not that you're trying to get back to the person that you fell in love with. It's that you're trying to fill in the gaps of their hollowness in order to have connection, because that connection was never really there to begin with. It never actually existed. They were just mimicking and then using dark empathy to earn your trust and then undermine you. And quite honestly, to suck you dry. Like really and truly, you have to be careful of this because it is like your battery being dimmed. And so if you sense that somebody is this way, the vacancy, all of these things, really pray to God as to how does he want you to interact with them? They're still people. I mean, all of them are still people. I have a lot of compassion for mind control victims and people that have been grown up in Satanism. And by the way, Satanism is often a huge part of mind control. It's a huge part of the experimentation because in mind control, again, they're looking to brainwash, control the mind. They're also looking to use these supernatural type experiences to spy on other countries and all this kind of stuff. And you may think that's conspiracy and far out, but it's very well documented. There's nothing that I'm saying that isn't very well documented. And they did these experiments on adults, and they did many, many, many experiments on children. And they've admitted that. That's all historical documentation. But the reason that they include Satanism with the experimentation is it's not just to terrorize the child and get them to split. It's also so that the demons can be there to bring that supernatural power so that they can do the astral projection and the ESP and all of those different things. It's to bring in the demonic power. Now, to me, again, being on this side of it, I think that is so insane because wouldn't it just be better to be on the right side and be in the kingdom with the true power of the Holy Spirit, which far surpasses anything in the kingdom of darkness, hands down. But you have a lot of evil powers that are wanting to conquer, which is why sociopaths and narcissists are often indwelt with such evil, because only evil wants to conquer. Most people, in the way that we are created, we want to connect. We value love. We value connection. We value betterment. And on the dark side, it's the opposite. Our very first example of extreme narcissism, or really an extreme sociopath, is Satan. He's the perfect picture of it. So what has happened is that the more that Satan can go after creating a sociopath or even a narcissist, the more he can use that person for his kingdom, the more he can have control over that person, and the more he can put them in a situation where they're either wanting to have control or they're wanting to conquer. And those are the inner dynamics. However, here is where I personally believe that the world of psychology, which is man-driven, falls short. We have become way too science-based, you all. We really have. I'm not against science. I'm not against proving things. I'm not against looking at data. I think there's importance in that. But oh my goodness, do we fall short when we start to bring in these absolutes? A sociopath is born without a conscience, and that's just their life. Really? When Jesus came to set the captives free? No. A person who is a sociopath can not only be saved, but they can be transformed, because the power of the Holy Spirit is much greater than any darkness that they have been subjected to, whether it's through Satanism or mind control or trauma or generational experiences or whatever else has happened. The power of Jesus can break that and can save them. And I believe that the Lord even has a heart for them. At the same time, you as the person cannot save them. And that's the difference. You can't go out trying to save people who are operating as a sociopath. You will get really hurt if you do that. Because if you try to save them, you're going to going in on your own strength. And then what's going to happen is you're going to fill in the gaps of their vacancy with your care and your emotions and your connection. And you're going to be drained. And you're going to be pulled away from the purposes and the plans that the Lord has for you. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to somebody who is sociopathic or narcissistic is great injury. You know, the scripture in the Bible where Paul talks about giving them over to Satan. I mean, it's a very intense scripture. And really and truly what he is saying is you've done everything else. Now give them over to the enemy, because that great hurt may be enough to save them. And if it is, then restore them gently. So the best thing sometimes that can happen to somebody who's a sociopath or somebody who is highly narcissistic is that they suffer a great injury. And I don't mean like a physical injury, like a car accident. I mean an emotional injury. You know, a lot of times what gets to the core of the narcissist is when they go through something really intense. They lose a friendship, they go through a divorce, they have an estrangement that they didn't expect. They lose a job that was like a big part of their validation. And with a sociopath, sometimes it is a great injury that cuts through that hardness until they can get to somewhat of a connection. It's not easy. And again, in our human effort, it is an impossibility. And I feel like that is the message that the Lord wanted me to truly release today. If you try to go after saving somebody who's a sociopath, saving somebody who's a narcissist, you're going to be harmed. It will damage you. It will drain you. It will hurt you. However, these are people that we have to turn over to the Lord. And we turn them over to the Lord, and then the Lord can decide. I mean, maybe he does turn them over to the enemy. But in turning them over to the enemy, the hope is that they can see the enemy for who he truly is and see what will truly happen to them. And then it will drive them to Jesus. They've come up with this way of helping children who maybe are starting to exhibit signs of a disconnect from their conscience. And what they do is they do it through like corrective behavior modification. And it actually works, because what it does is instead of it being, oh, you hurt your sister, it's like, oh, you did this, then this is what's going to happen. And so what it does is it starts to utilize this behavior type modification that, if done well and done right, can actually help that child start to reconnect with conscience. Now, I truly believe too, if that child could then be given time of inner healing and deliverance, they would have a much better experience than just the behavioral part. But it does start to reteach them natural consequences for certain behaviors. Because the problem with a child who's disconnected, then what will happen is that they then are not really connecting to the effects of right or wrong. So they found that type of training for the parents is actually very helpful. But again, if you were to bring in the inner healing and the deliverance dynamics, you'd have a much better success rate. But when people are adults and they've seared and seared and seared and seared, this is why you can have people in religious communities and faith communities living very double lives. A sociopath can do that better than anyone, better than anyone. And narcissists can do it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that people who operate in narcissism are off the hook. A narcissist can do it, but it requires them to continue to have people to blame. A sociopath can do it, and it almost seems effortless for them. Now, internally, is it ultimately tearing them apart? Of course. Of course it is. But outwardly, they can walk two worlds without even blinking. Effortlessly and easily, they could do that. So again, go to the Lord, pray for them, understand that these people are often assignments. And it doesn't mean that we want to condemn them and say, oh, they're just bound for hell. Don't do that either. The Lord can work in ways that you can't even imagine. At the same time, remember the danger of someone like that. And don't try to save them in your own strength. If there's a person in your life who exhibits these qualities and the Lord calls you away from them, stand away from them, because they're coming in to drain you. If the Lord calls you to love them from a distance, love them from a distance. If the Lord calls you to intercede for them, intercede for them, because that sometimes is the best weaponry. But really be praying for their internal dynamics, because there's so much happening inside, and the demons are wanting to take up more and more and more space in that vacancy. And so combat that in your prayers. And most importantly, protect your cargo. We don't talk about that enough as Christians. Yes, we're to lay our lives down and love people. It's so true. But we're also to love the people that the Lord calls us to. And we want to be careful of the people that come that are trying to drain us and take us off task and off purpose. So I just want to thank you for listening today. And I just want to ask you to share this podcast, subscribe, make sure that you give this podcast a like. And again, let's get this information out there.